Now, the first thing you would do is you'd hold your breath.
He didn't create this situation of fear, he merely exploited it.
Phoning in questions concerning the invasion.
It's on another record, which will come in later, but I'm keeping the record on which it was originally recorded.
Perhaps the most often asked question, or one related to it, is one that we nor no one else, unfortunately, can answer.
What isn't there to love about two well-educated, adorable women talking about frozen dead people?
Well, and maybe people.
Maybe people.
Well,
for me, it's
yours are people. One of mine's a maybe people.
Maybe people.
Welcome to It Began in the Basement. Laura, don't you dare laugh at me. I'm Megan.
I'm Laura.
And today we're here to talk about a subject that I think you can relate to this time of the year. Snow is falling. Icicles are forming. Sometimes there's corpses in the icicles.
Corpseicles. The first time you sent that to me is...
Did I say Corpseicles?
You did, more than once, and I misread it as Corpseicles, and I was like, what? Because I was doing the research for this
relevant,
episode.
Though. We would do something about Corpseicles. Corpseicles.
Corpseicles. You were the one who coined that term.
Yeah, well, I think if there's not a metal song about that, there really should be.
So what made you interested in, I should say, mummies in general, because Corpseicles are really mummies, just freeze-dried rather than dry-dried.
It's like astronaut ice cream as compared to beef jerky.
That was an absolutely humanizing way of talking about the relics of the dead.
Well, and there's some cannibalism in here, too, so, we got the whole smorgasbord.
We are the best, hands down.
What got me into it was my mom. Because
Really?
She teaches gifted kids, and one of the books that she reads to them is about the Franklin expedition. And I was talking to her over Thanksgiving and thinking about things I wanted to do for the podcast. And I said, I think I want to do bodies frozen in ice, because I had read about my second topic, that's the Minnesota Iceman. And she got all excited, and she said, ooh, I just finished this book with my kids. It's about the Franklin expedition, and they found some frozen mummies. And then we pulled up pictures, and that's what I wanted to talk about.
That definitely explains it. I think for me, fascination with mummies and how amazingly well preserved a body can last for how long is interesting, because one of the topics that I have is Juanita, the ice mummy of the Inca. I'm not a huge fan of the name the researchers gave her, but apparently that particular segment of the mountains had thawed enough where they saw this splash of color against the snow.
Of her clothing?
Mm-hmm. So it's like we're the only ones out here.
Why don't you just go into that? Why don't you tell us about Juanita?
As far as we know, in Incan culture, ritual ceremonies that sometimes required human sacrifices, I'm sure everybody's aware of to some degree, serve the function of assuring rain, appeasing particular gods, or to act as an accompaniment to significant events such as eclipses, earthquakes, and droughts, which, in my book, am I a fan of human sacrifice? Obviously, no, but
we almost had a fight about this.
It's not dumb!
I'm like, human sacrifice is dumb.
It's not dumb, it's a cultural difference!
Yeah, you went all anthropologist on me, and I went all humanist on you.
I'm very good friends with an anthropologist who travels to Europe 4 or 5 times a year, so we talk a lot, so she rubs off on me, and I'm like, well, they're dead, so it's fine.
But they weren't dead when they started. They were doing just fine.
Holy shit.
Well, you either sacrifice the hot ones or the poor ones.
But I always, with this type of sacrifice, as I told you at the time, I thought for sure it would be slave kids or something.
Yeah.
To serve some function in the afterlife. No, it was the children of nobility.
Do you know if they were kind of groomed for this from birth?
Yes. Well, not from birth, but what they were able to study in this particular corpse's appearance. I may have her mixed up with another one because the article itself that I used as a reference point had 4 or 5 mummies all together, which was great. But for example, in preparation for the sacrifice, one had all of his or her hair put in over 200 braids. Meticulous attention to detail. This was a very serious
because you want to please the gods.
Yes, exactly. So for me, what makes the ice mummies of the Inca so interesting is that a number of them have been found at extreme elevations, some reaching 23,000 feet. If you factor in the fact that none of our modern equipment, the trek to get up there, it is a significant investment of time and emotional effort and all that, and physical effort to get up there. Incredibly rare, important events such as the death of an emperor also might have required human sacrifice, so that royalty would have an escort to the other world. This is where you start to see massive eye roll. I'm sure you heard that through the audio. It's fine, whatever. Well, and it just makes me glad that we don't have it now, but that also, the children of nobility being sacrificed makes more sense for the death of an emperor versus an eclipse or something like that. For me,
or like
anyway.
if you have an Egyptian pharaoh, they had their servants, they had their cats, they had everything, and sometimes animals just en masse.
Yep.
I'm sure.
Also, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, I mean, other than, weather phenomena, that kind of thing is very obvious when looking into history and these rituals and their purpose. A number of these sacrificial sites are located near trans-mountain roads, which run east-west and lengthen north-south running ranges. The juxtaposition between these sacrificial sites and the roads indicate that sacrifices were made as the empire expanded, and that sacrifices were also made to bless the roads themselves and ensure the safety of travelers. Which to me, again, makes sense, but I feel reserved in trying to commentate on these beliefs because I'm coming from a modern Western perspective, whereas with this type of research, and especially if we get into more topics similar to this, one of the things you'll notice is that ancient beliefs like the Incan, the articles that are written for public mass consumption, like the Smithsonian Magazine, that was one of the, I think it was actually the reference that I used for this, was they summarized these people's beliefs as almost childlike sounding, but they're as advanced as modern accepted Christianity today.
Yeah, if you were a complete outsider, imagine this for a moment, dear listeners, and you had a completely different faith and someone told you, my faith is based around a celestial virgin birth in the Middle East, and my God is a triad. He is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It is all one, it is all separate, it is all knowing, it is omniscient. If you had never heard that before, you would probably just roll your eyes and be like, oh my goodness, those silly foreign customs.
Right, exactly. Cultural context for these things is absolutely everything. And I think, honestly, that's why we sort of butt heads on that, because for me, it's like African, South American, anything that's not the West, as in Europe and the US, I'm out of my element, and I would be the first person to admit that. There's a whole cultural depth that we're not really getting from these articles that are written for public mass consumption.
Oh.
With these high elevation sites, that's where Juanita was originally discovered. For me, what makes Juanita really special and interesting and unique is that she was completely frozen. Now, when I say completely frozen, you might think these ice mummies, quote unquote, as freeze-dried, essentially, but she was completely intact, as in you put turkey into your freezer. Intact. So this means her internal organs, skin, hair, blood, even the contents of her stomach were intact. And what's very cool is that this provides a window into the history of what do the Incan people eat? What were the lives of the nobility like? To me, those types of discoveries are really very cool.
How do they know that she was nobility?
Previous research had been conducted, and it was the quality of the textiles of her clothing, the contents of her stomach,
But couldn't they just have made the sacrifices very fancy things for the end?
Also, many of these sacrifices are on the portlier side, so that indicates being better fed. Maybe not outright obese, for example, but you can tell, a slave child versus the child of at least an upper echelon family.
I mean, maybe, but if you're chosen, even if you're from a lower caste, they can pork you up real quick.
That's true. So I'm not an archaeologist. I don't know.
Excuse me, if you're an archaeologist, please tell us. There is not enough information on this site. Thank you.
But of course, the public is not going to ask that kind of question. That's why it wasn't
I'm just question. What if they just picked a kid and fattened him up?
That's entirely true. But also, that's super cool because it means that her DNA can be studied, and previous mummies have been studied. Their living descendants have been found. And I think, that's really cool, but that's also really creepy because it's guess what? We dug up your great, 10 times great aunt. And she's now on display in a museum. It's kind of
Do you want to go visit it? It's like a really public cemetery.
Museums are kind of that, really, if you think about it. And also, what was a clue to her being the child of nobility was that her location was so close to Cuzco, the capital city of the Inca. So those things combined, the textile of her clothing, the location, that type of thing, are indications that she was of royal birth or noble birth. The thing with this thing is, though, you may be completely right.
Mhm.
There's no way to tell this 100%, you know, like, it is literally like, oh, we have this book and 90% of the pages are missing, and you just find bits and pieces of pages, discoveries, and cover, and that's what I like about archaeology.
Well, and then you update it as you go, ideally.
Yep.
Hopefully, it's a nice thing about science is ideally you're not so married to your ideas that if they have to change and evolve, pun intended and relished, that you'll allow for that.
Yep, absolutely. So I just find that really interesting. I think what stuck out to me the most about that is that it wasn't just, you know, maybe it was a kid born and bred for the purpose, or I'm just surprised it wasn't a slave kid, because when I think that type of thing, like, usually think slave servants, that kind of thing, but it may have been an honor if, assuming this is true, and the researchers got it right, I'm assuming it would have been an honor for the family to have been chosen.
Or, I mean, I don't know, they could have possibly had volunteers, and perhaps your family was very well taken care of if you were a volunteer.
That's entirely possible, too.
I have questions. If you're an archaeologist, please call me.
Or anthropology, just message my friend Mel, be like, oh, I have questions.
Actually, my podcast partner has questions. They're getting really annoying.
But it's great, because that means your interest in being gunned.
I want to know exactly who they were torturing and killing. It's very important.
Not torture, though.
No?
It was just
the killing, then.
But
how did
human
they kill
sacrifice.
them? Did they just leave them up there and they freeze to death, or what?
That's what it sounds like happened, but I'm not 100% sure. They did not specify.
Well, I mean, I guess if she'd had a head injury or a knife wound, they would have seen it. If she was so perfectly
and
preserved.
that's where Utsi comes into play. But please, what is the first one that you'd like to discuss?
The first one I'd like to discuss is the Franklin expedition. This is the event that my mom told me about, and it's fun to think that this is what the gifted kids are learning about in our school district. But I think it's pretty good. They'll be set. They'll be set to know that life is nothing but a cruel game where you could freeze to death in the Arctic.
Basically, but you know what? That's okay. That means you're free to do anything you want, include freeze to death in the Arctic.
So the Franklin expedition. It was an expedition, and it was intended to chart the remainder of the Northwest Passage, which was a sea route that would connect the Atlantic and the Pacific, so it's kind of like the Panama Canal. It would definitely speed trade along if you didn't have to go over land or go all the way down and around the Horn.
Right, yeah, no, that makes sense.
So Rear Admiral Sir John Franklin was the person who was supposed to head the expedition, and this was a stupid idea, because he was not in great health and he was 59, but they tried to get someone else to do it, and they said, nah. So he was pretty much the only one. They wanted to get this done, and it was supposed to only be about 300 miles of British-Canadian coast, and the last of it, so it would be finishing something up. And so it wasn't supposed to be a big deal.
Right, supposed to be. Famous last words.
Yeah, it was not supposed to be. Now, this is also where I think they made a tremendous mistake. The two ships that they took were called the HMS Terror and Erebus.
Guys.
That's a self-fulfilling prophecy right there.
Guys.
But the ships were pretty impressive. They were very well equipped. They had 8,000 tins of food, which was about 3 years' worth of food. But they were ordered about 2 months before the expedition, so the canning quality was not great.
Oh, super.
Yeah. But they also had a massive library with over 1,000 books in it, so they were at least keeping everyone entertained. They were powered by former locomotive engines, so they were steam-powered as well, which, again, should have kind of prepared them and gotten them through a lot of this ice and problem, but that didn't happen. And it also provided steam heating for the crew. Again, if you're going to go on an expedition, this sounds pretty good. We got lots of food, we got lots of books, it's going to be beautiful for the most part, and you're not going to freeze to death.
My real question is, can I live on this ship? Because it sounds really great, especially during the winter time.
Is it warmer than your apartment?
I don't know, actually.
There were 134 men on board to start. Most of them were English. There were a couple Irishmen and a couple Scots. But only 2 of the people actually had any Arctic experience, and one of them was a surgeon.
Wow.
Yeah.
Guys, I have a feeling I'm going to be saying that a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Come on.
So they left England in the summer of 1845, and they stopped in Iceland, which was pretty much the last time anything went to plan. So they kind of stocked up again, and then they took off to go up to the top of British Canada. So 3 people die of tuberculosis right off the bat.
This is such a great start to our trip.
Because it's not actually that many people when you think about it. Like 134 people?
No.
That's not a ton, and these are big ships.
And also, one of those people is an absolute linchpin in the fact that he is both a surgeon and has prior experience with the Arctic. If he goes, Oh, well.
Oh, well. So those 3 people who died, it was found out that it was from a combination of tuberculosis and lead poisoning. Because like I said, with those cans, those 8,000 tins of food
Yeah.
that they just slapped off real quick, they were not sealed well at all. So all the lead that they used to seal it was bubbling and leaking into the food.
Nothing tastes as good as Mom's lead-filled venison. Oh, God.
So these guys were buried on Beachley Island, and they were the sailors John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain. Now, their graves remained untouched in the Arctic chill and were pretty much undisturbed until 1984, when they were exhumed by the Betty expedition. The problem was, even though the graves were as they had been for some time, the ground was frozen solid. So it took some work to get it up. But when they finally opened up the coffin of John Torrington, which was in great shape, the plaque atop it read, John Torrington died January 1st, 1846, aged 20 years. They were surprised at how well preserved he was. Even his clothing was perfectly preserved. He was mummified and had become leathery, but he was otherwise fine. There wasn't any hint of decay. There wasn't even a smell. Even his eyeballs were intact and open, of course. And he didn't seem to have rigor. His limbs were still bendable, and they could do that.
So this doesn't sound like a full-stop freeze-dried thing. This sounds
No.
like a Juanita level, let's throw turkey in the freezer for
Yeah,
Thanksgiving
like,
leftovers.
because they had to pour hot water on the ice to get to him, because there was permafrost.
Yeah, that's interesting how even just from the separate research we've done, we're already able to tell, like, the integrity, such as it is, of the corpses. Because freeze-dried, like, you try to move an elbow, like, that's
I know, you're just
coming
ready-
off.
Wow.
Just like, well, I have an arm now. Like,
Yeah.
okay, that's cool.
Just put it back in. Just cover that one up. It's fine.
Just stitch it on. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
So they did a 4-hour autopsy. That was it. And it revealed that he had died of malnutrition and lead poisoning. So they gently reburied everything and replaced it so it looked the same and moved on. So let's go back to what happened to everybody else. Because people were still alive for a while. It turns out that in the Arctic, everything freezes, including the water. And sometimes it doesn't thaw in the summer. And that is what happened. Tuberculosis and the poorly sealed food and hypothermia start killing people. And they're not all of them are going too quick, but it's a few here and there. But what kind of kills it for everybody is when Franklin dies in June of 1847. So the crew has no leadership and they're stranded on King William Island.
I can't help but wonder what was originally the thing to introduce tuberculosis to the group.
Yeah.
Like if somebody had like an infection or they were a carrier and they didn't know. Being in such a cut-off close environment with so many other people, like that is just a hotbed for that kind of thing. So, I don't know.
Well, this is kind of where we lose what's going to happen to everybody, and we have to just go by clues that people find, some kind of oral tradition from the Inuits, who were the only people to really come in contact with these people again. Because a lot of Arctic explorers would leave notes. So they would build these big cairns, and they would write paper notes, and they would stick them in the cairns. So that's where we get a lot of this information from, was people would find the cairns and pull the notes out.
Can you imagine, say you're at the cabin, it is just frigid outside, you're the only person out there, there's not another soul. Say you go on a hike into the middle of the woods, and you find a cairn, and you find one of those notes. I know, for us it'd be like, ooh, this is cool, but like, that's kind of like fundamentally horrifying.
Yeah.
Like, your potentially last words as a living person are immortalized on a piece of paper in a pile of rocks in close to the Arctic.
Yeah.
Like, there's something viscerally kind of like, oh, about that.
So after Franklin dies, nobody else really feels like documenting everything because it's not going great. They can't move the ships, so they abandon them. They fill up the lifeboats with as much food as they can and supplies and use them like sleds and start dragging them, hoping to go south to the mainland.
I mean, it makes sense.
I mean, yeah, what else are you going to do? So not too far from the ships, you find your first set of dead bodies. But the thing that is a little creepy about it is the bones have cut marks on them. So there's tool marks on them because, hey, you gotta eat, right?
Once the consciousness light turns off, you're technically just meat.
Well, what else are you gonna do with it?
Yeah,
Like,
it's
if you're
true.
starving to death, I don't blame anybody.
That I was about to say, and then that means not lead poison. I'm like, no, wait, never mind.
Ugh, yeah, good point.
So, cyclical, everybody dies, hooray!
Well, there's some more small clusters of bodies that are kind of found along the way, and a lot of it's just the cold. The cold is killing them, and the lead poisoning, and then they're starting to starve.
Huh.
So from 1850 on, Inuit people saw and did trade with these people. They talked about seeing desperate-looking white people, and they found a lot of tents with bodies just frozen inside that they left behind. So back in England, they hadn't heard from these people in a couple of years. So they sent out more ships to figure out what happened, but once they got to about the same point, they went west, whereas most of the survivors went southeast, so they missed them entirely.
Oh, jeez.
But every once in a while, they would run into someone who was Inuit who would tell them, like, yeah, I saw these guys about there 2 years ago, so I don't know what to tell you. So several of those ships were then lost to the ice, and one of them was the HMS Resolute, which will come in later. Anyway, people got kind of sick of the whole thing. Nobody really wanted to spend money on it. And so by 1855, whatever equipment and bodies could be recovered were taken home and reburied, and the rest of the crew was simply declared dead in service.
That's not sad as hell at all. No.
Well, they continued to find more bodies, but, like, nobody survived this.
Right. Yeah, it's just you can tell. Like, even if you don't find physical evidence, it's just you go far enough out into the cold, and the tuberculosis, and the lead poisoning, and the isolation, and your body is going to collapse.
It's a grim way to die. Like, one of the Inuits, or at least some of the oral tradition that they had, said that they had run into these people, and they had to make a decision, and they said, we couldn't support them all. There's no way that we could take all these people and add them to the people we have to take care of.
And that is completely fair, because if you know anything about how those people lived, by the skin of your teeth, many times.
Yeah, they can't take on 100 more people.
Yeah.
And it's the Arctic. The resources are scarce as it is. It's feast or famine.
Yep, basically.
So the HMS Resolute, which was one of the ships that got stuck trying to retrieve the people who'd gotten lost in the Franklin expedition in the first place, was recovered in 1855, and it was discovered by American whalers. It was then returned to England as a goodwill gesture to Queen Victoria, and it hung around until 1879 when it was no longer useful, so it was taken out of rotation and scrapped. However, those remains were made into a desk, and that desk was then gifted back to the American, notably Rutherford B. Hayes, a president.
That entire exchange is the most English to American relationship I have ever heard in my entire life. Like, to be completely honest.
I do say thank you for the boat. Here's a desk.
Yeah, basically.
Well, it's called the Resolute Desk. It has a plaque on it. And the only presidents who haven't used it were Johnson, Nixon, and Ford.
Can't trust Nixon anyway, so
yeah, that's right. Sometimes it's in the residence rather than the Oval Office, though.
Huh.
So the desk itself has been modified a few times. Roosevelt requested panels to hide his leg braces, but he died before they were completed. Yeah. But Truman liked the eagle motif that was on the panels, so he had them installed. And it's notable that the eagle on that panel is facing the olive branch of peace, whereas before the presidential seal had the eagle head facing the arrows of war.
Huh, that's neat.
So there's one more thing. In 2014, another ship was found. It was the Erebus. And after it had sunk, it stayed in remarkably good shape south of King William Island. There's only really one hint. In 2008, an Inuit man had mentioned to a researcher that he saw a mast sticking out of the water and took a picture of it. But he lost the camera and thought that it would be bad luck to mention it.
That type of information is what makes me love folklore and folk knowledge so much, because you may not have like a written tradition, if some of this stuff happened 300, 400 years ago, but it gets passed down and you see these elements like this, that it's just like people just knew, and it just became part of the tribal collective knowledge of the area.
And they might not have known that like anyone else cared.
Yep.
As it came through, like, yeah, that mast has been there forever. Oh yeah, I guess that's kind of what you guys look for, huh?
Yep.
Well, it's there.
It's folklore and folk knowledge. Like, folk knowledge may eventually evolve into folklore. It's just this whole other thing. That type of thing. Who's to say, like, if they had never discovered the ship that the mast was attached to, like, that could have become a whole other story by itself. Like, to me, that stuff is really interesting.
So yeah, that's the Franklin expedition. Ended pretty badly for just about everybody.
The everyone is dead expedition.
Yeah, it didn't pan out fantastically. All right, so that's all that I've got for the Franklin expedition. What's your next mummy?
So I think out of the two, and out of the 4 or 5 that I found in total and decided to investigate, this guy's my favorite. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of the name the researchers gave him, but bear with me. Even if I knew the correct pronunciation, I'd still butcher that too. It's Otzi. He's 5,300 years old, and what immediately struck Oh my god, that's a pun, because he got murdered to death. Murdered to death!
It was a club in the heist.
What originally stuck out to me about his particular story was when his body was first uncovered, they were able to tell that he had tattoos.
Mm-hmm.
They did not know the extent of them. It was only more recently that they were able to count all of them because a full body scan that didn't essentially destroy the body was done. He had 61. And I think, like, tattooing in general is very interesting to me, so I was like, yeah, this is awesome. So, what I found really interesting about him is he's joined the ranks of frozen mummies that provide, as I said earlier for Juanita, a material window into humanity's history. For me, again, I don't have a background in this, but when you have that tangible evidence of what these people ate, what their clothing looks like, to me it makes the history come alive. Like, the ancients weren't any different than us. I mean, Stone Age people probably, but 5,300 years ago, that's not that long, really. But again, what makes him super special is that he's over 5,000 years old, and his body was so well preserved that scientists were unable to uncover what his final hours were like. The details of the tattoos on his body, where I mentioned before there are 61, and how old he was when he died. I'm sure we've cleared this up by now, but just for reiteration, when people normally think mummification, they think arid climates like the desert. When Otzi passed away, which was around 3500 BCE, the frigid temperatures of the mountain range combined with glacial meltwater made mummification possible. And you'd think water would contribute to rot, but given that it's so cold in that type of climate, it makes sense.
So it was completely unintentional.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. And I think also that was the case with Juanita as well, and it seems like the one you just talked about is the same thing.
Yeah, they were just trying to get bodies off that boat.
Yeah, exactly. Researchers surmise that Otzi was around 45 when he died, which was due to a stone-tipped arrow fired into his back, as well as being bludgeoned at the back of the skull, if memory serves.
That is thorough.
According to New Historian, which is a resource that he used for this, Otzi suffered from a variety of delightful ailments, such as advanced gum disease, gallbladder stones, Lyme disease, whipworms in his colon, and atherosclerosis, which is the thickening of the arterial walls. Geneticists were also able to determine that he was genetically predisposed to heart disease. Man, we have it good these days. Like, yeah, you may have all these things, but there's things you can do.
At least you won't have worms.
Yeah, exactly. But again, my interest with tattooing, I naturally gravitated to the details on that. And what I found particularly interesting is that Otzi's tattoos are thought to serve medical or therapeutic purposes, which really most of ancient tattooing is in that vein. But previous research also indicated that 80% of where Otzi was tattooed corresponded with Chinese acupuncture points to treat rheumatism.
Huh.
I absolutely think there's something to acupuncture, and I think if you're living out in harsh elements long enough, and it's trial and error of trying to relieve stress on your joints, stress on your heart, you will come up with things that work. Like, maybe not to the degree we have today, but again, folk knowledge and figuring things out over time.
Well, or things you think will work.
Yes.
Placebos work.
Yeah, which is odd, because the human brain is a weird machine. But yeah, no, I thought Otzi was very interesting, and he's very well preserved, and he is stored at a balmy negative something, because otherwise he's going to gradually decompose, Yeah. But just that kind of thing. It sounds where he was discovered was in the middle of nowhere, so I always wonder, what were you nerds doing out in the cold to discover a dead guy from 5,000 years ago? But then this is why I'm not an anthropologist, or archaeologist, I should say.
That looks cold. That looks hot. That looks dry. I don't wanna.
You're not wrong, which is what makes me the world's worst potential archaeologist. I'm like, I'm gonna go take a nap.
I'm just not patient enough to do all that excavation.
I love reading about it, because
it's done.
Dead people are great company. Like, sitting in a graveyard, not to sound like a spooky 15-year-old, but graveyards, dead people are pretty good company. Mm-hmm. It's like, that's totally a normal thing to do, Laura. What are you talking about?
Normal, Laura. Everything is fine.
Yeah, so I don't know, just the fact that you can tell so much about how someone passed from the state of their skeleton, as it's discovered, and
Sucks you couldn't fix it while you were alive, buddy.
Yeah, I wanted to take that one Coursera class, but it was called Osteoarchaeology, The Truth in Our Bones, and that was the whole time. I'm like, someone was waiting to use that title. You tell.
They were so happy when they got the opportunity to teach it.
And I just didn't have the time to take it. I'm like, God damn it. But I think I still have her information. I'm going to reach out to that professor and be like, can we talk to you about the state of dead people when they're discovered? Just a creepy face.
I'm normal. So normal. Well, you had an Iceman, and I have an Iceman too.
Right.
Alright, so my final, possible person.
Possible.
Possible is the Minnesota Iceman. Also known as the ape-man creature of Whiteface, the creature of ice, or the missing link.
Those first two titles sound like they were blurring into one long, convoluted, somebody was on drugs when they named him kind of thing. But no, that makes more sense now.
Indeed. So he's a 6-foot tall, hairy creature, and he's in a custom freezer that has a glass top. It's kind of like a coffin at this point. He was first presented in the 1960s by Frank Hansen, and Frank has quite a few stories about the Iceman. His original origin story was that the creature was locked in a Siberian ice floe that was found by a wealthy and religious Californian.
I actually believe that to some degree, because California.
After that, he was telling people that it was pulled out of the ocean by Chinese fishermen. But in 1970, he was interviewed by Saga magazine, and he claimed that he shot the beast while deer hunting and got so freaked out that he left it for a month and returned and found the body frozen. It hadn't been disturbed by other animals, and he even mentions that. That's why he said it was so strange. It didn't look like predators had gotten into this at all. So he wanted to take it home, and he placed it in his basement freezer, and he and his wife poured water over it until it was in a frozen block of ice. Normal.
Totally. Yes, let me brag to everyone about this corpse that I have that is completely frozen.
Well,
it could be a person, but it sounds like big fish syndrome.
And he also had shot it in the face. So there was that. He claimed eventually that it had charged him and he had no choice but to shoot it in the face.
No choice, quote unquote.
But he apparently got the idea to show it because he was into showing rare John Deere tractors at fairs. So this didn't actually go like the carny route at all. This was something that you would see at state fairs. And so he wanted to display it and make some money. And he talked to his attorney, and his attorney told him, if this ends up being a human, you could get charged with murder.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the least of it.
So his attorney, who was apparently infinitely clever, said, why don't you get a fake one made and document the process? And that way you can show anybody that it's just like a rubber monster with pictures of the process, and you won't get charged for murder. It is convoluted. So...
Convolutedly delightful.
Oh, yes. So he was going to make the model, or get the creature made, but he was going to keep the original, so that he would have the proof that it wasn't real. And then he would show the fake one for a year, just to throw people off, and then he would swap it for the real one.
Huh.
So he claims in 1967, he brought in Howard Ball, who was an early Disney Imagineer, and he was the artist who did the mammoths at the La Brea Tar Pits.
Disney just got super dark.
We could do a whole episode on that. But he employed him to make like the carcass, and then he employed two people, Pete and Betty Corral, from a wax studio to do all the hair work, because it was a lot of intricate hair that they would put into the body. So he exhibited the gaff for a 2-year tour. And in 1968, he thought it would be safe to show the real thing without being accused of murder. But what he didn't count on was Dr. Bernard Hervelmans, who's known as the father of cryptozoology, and Ivan Sanderson. He didn't count on them seeing this creature when they were in America. Now, when they saw it, they concluded very quickly that it was a Neanderthal. And they thought that it had also been killed because it had one missing eye and the other was dangling out of the socket. So they thought that it had been shot in the eye and the bullet dislodged the other eye. They also mentioned that it seemed like there were fluids leaking into the ice. It was pretty bloody. And when you look at this thing, it's in this block of ice. So you can kind of see it. You can kind of make it out. So when Dr. Hervelman and Sanderson saw it, they couldn't see the whole thing and they didn't thaw it out either. But they claimed that there was a part of it that was exposed, and that they could smell rot. And they went in assuming that it was a hoax as well. So they examined it for 3 days, but it was still in very thick ice. So kind of take that as you will. So Frank Hansen claimed that the fleshy smell was from them putting a light too close to it and breaking the glass, and that was the result of the weird odor that came out of it. I know. And it's in this refrigerated coffin, as you can see.
Yeah.
So even though they were allowed to look at it, Hansen didn't count on them publishing their findings. So once that happened, there was a lot of backpedaling because he couldn't quite claim as much that it was a rubber body because he had these 2 professional zoologists who had said, like, yeah, this is a real thing that this guy has. So they called in John Napier, who was a primatologist from the Smithsonian Institute. And when he investigated, he claimed it was just a rubber suit. It was just made out of foam, latex, and hair. But when you talk to Hansen, he claims it's because when he knew that the Smithsonian was coming for him, he swapped them again.
That will not actually surprise me at all, given the background you explained.
And so he just wanted to avoid any charges if it turned out to be a real man. And on top of it, he had carried this thing across multiple state lines at this point.
Great.
So again, this would be a lot of law breaking. So he had said that the only way that he would allow examination of the real deal, which he claimed to still have, was if he was granted amnesty from any law breaking that had occurred. And he said that it was supposedly just frozen in storage in the Midwest and wouldn't tell anybody where it was. In 1969, there was a border hang-up because Canada initially refused to let a humanoid body cross the borderline. Hansen claimed that it was a fake, so the negotiation came down to the Border Patrol wanting to x-ray it, and Hansen lost his mind and said, no, the owner of the body, because he was back to the story that it was a Californian that had lent him this to show. He went back to the original story of it being found by the Californian in the ice floe and brought back to show. It's very convoluted. In a 1989 interview, he reverts to the Chinese fisherman story and combines it with the Californian story, and says that the actual owner of the creature just wanted to remain anonymous. He also said that the owner was very famous and in show business and was incredibly religious, and he didn't want the creature being presented as a missing link that would undermine the Bible. Some people have concluded this man was Jimmy Stewart, but Hansen would never admit to anything. Hansen died in 2002, and he was claiming very close to his death that the owner was ready to either exhibit the creature again, or that if the owner was outed, he would just dump it back in the Pacific. So in the 80s, he took it off the circuit entirely, claiming that the big, famous, fancy owner wanted it back, and that it was back in storage and it was no longer in his possession, but that he had the fake rubber one. He stopped showing it at fairs, and everything kind of died down for about 10 years. However, it was on eBay in 2013.
I saw that post review. I'm like, why does Megan have a posting up that she's linking to that's $20,000 again?
Well, they didn't buy it for $20,000, though. It was to be sold for $20,000, but if you look at it, they took the best offer. And it was sold on February 21st, 2013 to Steve Busty, who's the owner of the Museum of the Weird in Austin, Texas.
Okay, that's a pretty great place for that to end up.
And I was watching an interview of Busty, and he wouldn't let the people in there film what the creature looks like now. Like, he wants you to come to the exhibit.
But that's fair.
That's fine. That's fine.
That's fair.
I get it. But Busty says that he has a connection to the creature because he saw it in the mid-70s as a kid, and this is where it's going to get more fun. It was in a truck, and people were paying to see it in a coffin in a Kmart parking lot in Homestead. And we live in Pittsburgh, and Homestead is about 18 minutes away from here.
I came here at the wrong time.
You did.
I existed at the wrong time, apparently.
Well, I was also looking up a bunch of information on this, because a lot of people claim that when they were younger, they saw this thing as it was traveling around, and that it looks different than the one that Busty bought. So they're buying into the story that it's the two different ones.
Or it could be flawed child memory, too.
It could be, or the other option is it could be two different gaffs, because latex can't take a beating forever. And if you're freezing and thawing, and if he's making enough money off of this, he could have had multiple gaffs commissioned.
It's true.
Or it could have been an actual person. Because the FBI was also pondering investigating Hansen for murder.
It's
like you're carrying a body like across a lot of state lines there, pal.
No, but he's not being secret about it.
Well, that's when he reverted back to the rubber model story.
I'm sorry, but this sounds like an incredibly gonzo episode of The X-Files.
Yeah, except they would end up finding it in, like, someone's basement freezer.
Oh, yeah.
But then the freezer would be gone because they can never prove anything. So I also read another... It was on one of the forums where people were talking about it, and somebody from Erie mentioned that they saw it in the Mill Creek Mall in the late 70s or early 80s.
Absolutely.
And that is the mall where I shop to this day when I go up to Erie.
All the creepy things. Just
All the creepy things. It was $4 to see it, or $2 extra if you wanted to take home a pamphlet with you. You weren't allowed to take pictures. So to increase this, Busty, the guy who owns it now, and the Iceman were featured on an episode of Shipping Wars, and so he wasn't allowed to discuss the Iceman until the episode had aired. And after it did, he was allowed to announce to people that the Iceman would be in the Museum of the Weird.
All I can think is, the truth is out there, and it is in an ice floe waiting for a Californian to find
A wealthy,
it.
religious Californian to find it. The most recent news is that Bernard Hilvelman's book has been re-released. He published a book called Neanderthal, The Strange Saga of the Minnesota Iceman, but he was French, so the original was published in French. He passed away in the early 2000s, I believe, and so this is an English translation of the book, is now released with a lot of his original pictures. It's a long book. It sounds pretty cool. I'm going to buy it. But when you look at the two guys, Hilvelman and Sanders was a bit of a nut.
A little bit.
Are you familiar with Ivan Sanders?
Vaguely.
Okay, so he thought that fake dinosaur prints that were made as a hoax belonged to giant penguins in Florida. And he also wrote a book about the reptilian aliens, and he was definitely on board with a lot of UFO-ness. So this is definitely somebody who wants to believe.
Why is it always reptilians? I would pay good money for
Why can't it be the
Labrador people.
Well, how about the Nordics? They're at least hot.
I mean, in all fairness.
Well, the Nordic aliens are apparently even way hotter.
Good to know.
Look, it's the reptilians, the Greys, and the Nordics. And how do you not know this?
I've heard of the reptilians and the Greys. I have not heard of the...
We'll talk about it later. We'll talk about it later. So that's what I've got for my frozen dead people. I would actually really love to go to Austin, Texas and go to this Museum of the Weird.
It sounds super cool. And I absolutely want to be friends with people who run with that museum.
I know.
Who run that museum, not run with that.
So thank you for listening. That's all we have on Frozen Dead Corpses for this week. If you want to find us, we're on YouTube, Facebook, and Podbean under It Began in the Basement, and we hope to see you next week.